Okay, Abraham Lincoln, you have made one big decision. You have decided you are not going to let the South secede peacefully from the Union. You are going to use military force to resist secession. Now you've got a second big decision, except it doesn't come upon you quite so suddenly. The decision about secession, whether or not to resist it, was something that you had to make on the moment you became President of the United States. This question, the second question, what are you going to do about slavery, is a question that builds. It's something that you said when you initially declared that you were not going to allow secession to stand, that slavery had nothing to do with it. It was a constitutional matter. The Constitution still protected slavery in the states. So South Carolina could still, in your interpretation, South Carolina is still part of the Union, and South Carolina can still have slavery as long as it wants. So this is the position you take. And through the first year and a half of the war, it's a position you stick to. In fact, as late as the summer of 1862, you are asked by Horace Greeley, a New York editor, "Mr. President, what's your position on slavery and the war?" Greeley was a very strong opponent of slavery, and he said, "Mr. President, you're fooling yourself if you think that this war is not about slavery. You can say it's not, but the Southerners, they know it's about slavery, that's why they left, and you know it's about slavery, you just don't want to admit it." And so Horace Greeley says, "Mr. President, you got to make a decision." So this is an editorial Greeley wrote in his paper. And you write a letter back to Horace Greeley in which you give your reply. And you say that your purpose is to save the Union. It is not to end slavery. And you say in your letter that if you could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, you'd do it. If you could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, you would do that. If you could save the Union by freeing half the slaves and leaving the other half in bondage, you would do that. Your job was to save the Union. Now, you went on to say that as a personal matter, you opposed slavery and you hope it ended. You hope it ended everywhere in the United States. But you did not believe, as of the summer of 1862, that this war is about slavery, and you're not going to make it a war about slavery. And you realize that if you do make it a war about slavery, then, once again, as I said in the previous lecture, that if you make it a war about slavery, then you are going to put the border states, the slave states who remain in the Union, in a really tough position. They are going to feel that their future is probably with the Confederacy. And for strategic purposes, this could be very dangerous to the United States, to the Union. You know, you might lose the war on account of this, and then you'd lose any kind of leverage over slavery. So that's part of it. There's another part of it. You know perfectly well that there are plenty of people in the North who don't want the slaves to be freed. Now, some of them simply don't care one way or the other because all the slaves are in the South, and you know, what does somebody who lives in Massachusetts or New York care about the plight of a poor slave in Georgia? Okay, humanitarianism will get you somewhere. But so there are a lot of people in the North who really don't care much one way or the other about slavery. They don't like it, but they don't think there's much to do about it. Oh, and furthermore, if you're going to ask a lot of those Northerners to go put their lives on the line, to go fight, and you tell them, why are they fighting? They're fighting to free the slaves. They say, forget it. I don't like slavery, but I'm not going to risk my life over it. So there's that. There's another element as well, and that is that a lot of people in the North are fairly recent immigrants, and they're often uneducated and unskilled. They're manual laborers. And they strongly suspect that if slavery ends, they're going to find themselves in competition for these low-level, unskilled jobs. And it's going to drive the wage rate down. It's going to drive their standard of living down. And so you know, they have an economic reason not to be enthusiastic about ending slavery. So you know all this. But on the other hand, you realize that at the bottom of all of this, slavery is this thing that has brought the Union to this breaking point where the two sides are fighting a war over the fate of the Union. You still think that your primary purpose is to end the war and save the Union. But you're beginning to think that maybe you can't save the Union without freeing the slaves. So going back to what you told Horace Greeley, you know, if you could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, well, you're starting to think it might come to that. There are a couple other things. One is that in a lot of cases, the slaves are freeing themselves. As Union armies approach a particular part of the South, and most of the fighting, nearly all the fighting, takes place in the South. As Union armies approach a particular region, slaves on plantations in those regions flee their plantations, flee their masters, flee their bondage, and show up in the Union camps. And they say, here I am, I want to be free. And what are you going to do about this? According to your interpretation of the Constitution, well, they're not free. They can't be free just because they say they're free. And as President of the United States, you have an obligation to restore property that's wrongfully taken from owners. So at first, some of your generals are given orders, you got to send the slaves back. Well, that seems pretty intolerable because I thought you were opposed to slavery, and I thought you were the head of the party that's on record as being opposed to slavery. So a slave frees himself and then you send them back. Boy, that's just going in exactly the wrong direction. Your generals increasingly point out to you that, okay, sometimes having all these fugitive slaves in camp is a problem, but you realize, Mr. President, that each slave who flees a southern plantation or a southern workshop weakens the South that much, because this war is going on a lot longer than people had thought at the outset. And it's going to become, in one sense or another, a war of attrition. Which side is going to wear the other one down first? Which side is going to run out of resources to wage the war first? And if we can weaken the South economically, then it'll shorten the war. It will save the lives of some Union soldiers. So, Mr. President, you got to factor that into your consideration. One other thing. The world is looking on. The world was watching the United States, dealing with the slave question, dealing with this secession crisis. The world had been very curious about the United States since the founding of the United States in the 1770s. Really? Can you create this country just by, declaring independence and then by writing a constitution? Can you do that? The countries of Europe had evolved organically over centuries. There was no moment when France came into existence, no moment like July 2nd, 1776. We remember July 4th because that's when the Declaration of Independence was accepted, was signed. But the vote for independence came on July 2nd. So the United States begins in July 1776. France, when did that begin? Well, it began over centuries. And same thing for nearly every country, every other country of Europe, most countries around the world. This idea that you could just say, let's create a country and do it. Well, this was novel. It was exciting. Is it going to work? Can people really do this? And so the eyes of the world had been on the United States almost from the start. Now the eyes of the world are really on the United States. Can the United States survive? There are a lot of people in Europe who said this will never work. Republics, people can't govern themselves. They have to be governed from on high, from on top. You have to have a king. You have to have a strong leader. And republics, they're just going to, especially once the republic became a democracy where people actually run things themselves, give me a break. Okay, so there are a lot of people who in Europe who were quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, rooting for the Confederacy, hoping the Union would crash. And President Abraham Lincoln, you're aware of this, and you got to take this into consideration. There's also this question of slavery. Britain had been a major player, a major force in the international slave trade until the 1830s. And the British in the 1830s had outlawed slavery within the British Empire. And after that time, they became an active opponent of slavery around the world. I mean, part of it was humanitarian, Part of it was self-interested. If we can't have slaves, we don't want anybody else to have slaves because they undercut us on labor costs. So the British were strongly opposed to slavery. And Britain was a key potential player in this war between the United States and the Confederacy, because Britain was the principal customer for Southern cotton. And Southern cotton, what Southerners called king cotton. This was this big export, the biggest export of the United States before secession, the biggest export of the Confederacy after secession. And because the British textile industry leaned so heavily on Southern cotton, the Confederates, the leaders of the Confederacy, thought that the British would have to give their support to the South to make sure that the South survived. And so they were counting on this. But Britain was kind of slow to do this, in part because the British, they saw this war coming, and so they had stockpiled cotton. In part because the British, well, they didn't want to violate their own pledges of opposition to slavery. And so they were still on the fence. Do we recognize the Confederacy or not? By recognizing the Confederacy, by diplomatically recognize the Confederacy, this would be a huge boon to the project of Southern independence, because then the South could straightforwardly borrow money from Britain. It could have ships built in Britain. It could do trade with Britain. It could have all the other advantages of connection with arguably the most powerful country in the world at this time in the 1860s. So the South really wants the government of Britain to recognize the Confederacy and then to give aid to the Confederacy. But the government of the Confederacy, the government of Britain is reluctant to do so because it doesn't want to endorse slavery. But at least until this time when Abraham Lincoln writes this letter to Horace Greeley, it's clear that in the mind of the President of the United States, this war isn't about slavery. So by aiding the Confederacy, Britain wouldn't be aiding slavery, just be aiding part of these former states of the United States. So, as pointed out to Lincoln, Mr. Lincoln, the most important thing you could do to prevent Britain from recognizing the Confederacy is to say that this is a war against slavery. Then the British, they couldn't recognize the Confederacy because for these last 30 years, they've been on record as opposing slavery, and they're not going to change their minds right now. So, President Lincoln, you have to make this decision. It's a decision that you realize you've been having to make all along. Until now, you've said this war is not about slavery. But increasingly you realize, well, the war is about slavery whether I recognize it or not. Oh, there's this possibility. Suppose the South should just declare tomorrow that we tried this independence thing and it's not working. So we're going to abandon the Confederacy and we're coming back to the United States. On the position that you've laid out, President Lincoln, you have to accept them in because you said they never left. And so they're going to come back in. And they're still going to have slaves. And we're going to be back where we were at the beginning of this conflict. Now, by this time, it's the summer of 1862, thousands of lives have been lost, tens of thousands of lives have been lost. And you're going to go back to the mothers and fathers and wives and other kin and friends of the people who've died and say, oops, it was all for nothing. That's going to be really tough for you to do and survive politically. Abraham Lincoln was a politician. He had ambitions. He wanted to get reelected. He wanted to carry his project through. So, as a result of all of this, you, Abraham Lincoln, have to decide, and now you're going to have to decide very quickly, very soon. Is this a war against slavery as well as a war against secession? Or are you still agnostic on the slave question? Well, what you decide, of course, is, well, I say of course. With hindsight, we know it's of course. At the time, no, it wasn't of course at all. But you decide that you are going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. You are going to declare the freedom of slaves. Now, this is going to be a carefully worded proclamation. You're going to say that you declare on your authority as Commander-in-Chief, because this has become a war issue. You're persuaded by the arguments of the generals, of your soldiers. And you think that you can justify it. You can justify this flip-flop in your interpretation of your power, your authority over slavery, by virtue of your responsibility, your authority as commander-in-chief, because as a war measure, you can free the slaves, because the slaves have become swept up in the war, and they are essentially instruments of war when on the side of the Confederacy, being used against the fruit of their labors is being used against Union soldiers, against the Union. And if brought over to the American side, then they can be weapons on behalf of the Union. So, you're persuaded that this is the position you're going to take. On your authority as commander-in-chief, you are going to free the slaves, but not all the slaves. Not the slaves in those states that did not join the Confederacy. So, the slaves in the states, in the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, they're still going to be slaves. Now, some people will say in Missouri or Kentucky, well, this is what we get for our loyalty. Okay, well, and the answer is, well, I should say, the slaves in those states are going to say that. This is what we get for our state's loyalty. We stay slaves when those slaves in Virginia, in the states that rebelled against the Union, they get freed. But for the slave holders in those states, yeah, that's what you get for your loyalty. You still get to claim your slaves. So this is what Lincoln does. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation saying that the slaves are freed in all of those states that are in rebellion against the United States. Again, this irony is pointed out that the slaves in the border states aren't freed. But you know, and nearly everybody else knows, that the time of emancipation for those slaves is coming too. Because if slavery is destroyed in the 11 states of the Confederacy, those are the most important slave states. Those are the states with the largest population of enslaved laborers. So if slavery ends in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and Louisiana and so on, slavery won't last long in Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware. So you say that as of now, more precisely as of January 1st, 1863, slaves in those rebellious states are freed. But you know, they know, everybody knows that freedom for the slaves in the other states, that's only a matter of time. Only a matter of time and only a matter of, oh, wait a minute, is the Union going to win the war? That's the question. So it's one thing to proclaim emancipation, but the states that are in rebellion, they're not listening. They're not accepting your statement. The war remains to be fought, and the Emancipation Proclamation will not actually become real law until and if the Union wins the war. So you can say the slaves are freed, but you still have to fight it out to ensure that they are.